and violence in the third world, the attacks on democracy, the attacks on freedom, the slaughters, whether it's Indonesia in 1965 or Central America today, the repeated interventions in places like Guatemala, that's the reason for it. It's the way to maintain a certain kind of world order, a world order in which U.S.-based interests will in fact prosper. That's
Let me pursue that, Professor Chomsky, with this question. Your summary of U.S. foreign policy in the post-war period implies a level of rationality, efficiency, and unswerving purpose at variance with the widespread perceptions of that policy, which frequently seems irrational, ineffective, and oscillating in character. What group do you see as driving force behind this policy, and how has it been so singularly effective in pushing its program?
Well, we can identify exactly who was involved. I mean, in fact, in the 1940s and the early 50s, there was quite sophisticated planning, I should say. This was a period of considerable intelligence. If you read the documentary record, you see thoughtful, careful planning of a kind which I've sampled. Now, it's not that they didn't make mistakes. You know, the world's a complicated place, and there were many mistakes. But it was largely successful in the interests that they attempted to achieve, the interests that I've described. As to identifying the people involved, that's easy. You can even find their names. You know, but it's more interesting than their names is the institutions they represented. Overwhelmingly, they're drawn from a small number of corporations, investment firms, half a dozen law firms that represent primarily corporate interests, people who had a broad picture of the needs of U.S.-based corporations, which, of course, dominate the state system, not surprisingly. That's the interest they represented. That's the world they organized. Now, you can say you like the world or you can say you hate it, but that's the world they organized with considerable thoughtfulness and, in fact, a lot of success. Now, since that period, it's been mostly a matter of following out the lines of policy that were already established. So, for example, in the case of Southeast Asia, we happen to have a very rich documentary record, reaching, in fact, way beyond the officially declassified materials because of the opening up of the Southeast Asia files after the Pentagon Papers affair. And what you see there, if you look, is simply the application of principles already established to this specific case, with very little innovative thinking, I should say. Today, we don't know what the planning is because we don't have the documents available, but you can make it out. You can make it out by watching the events unfold. The United States is, since the economic damage caused to the United States by the Vietnam War, they didn't know that was going to be so costly. Since that time, the U.S. economy has been in trouble. It's been necessary to expand the role of the state in protecting the relatively competitive sectors of the U.S. economy. We are moving towards a kind of protectionism. The major protectionism in the United States, in fact, is the support for high technology industry. In the United States, we have a system of a state-protected market, state-guaranteed market for high technology production, a system for forcing a public subsidy to high technology production, in particular the costly research and development aspect of high technology production. That's called the Pentagon. It's not just for producing weapons. So take a look at the history of the computer industry. You'll discover that in the 1950s, the core of any modern industrial society. You look in the 1950s when computers were not marketable, really. The support for research and development of computers was 100% the military system. By the 1960s, computers became sellable on the market. So that support by the state, forced subsidy through the state, reduced to approximately 50%. Now we're engaged in the development of what's called fifth-generation computers, big, huge computer development competing with Japan and so on. The state contribution shot up again. It's now approximately 100% for research and development through the Pentagon, NASA, which is just the front for the Pentagon, and the Department of Energy, which is primarily using them for the production of nuclear weapons. That's the system that we use to create a protected market for the parts of the economy that still function. And under the Reagan administration, which in fact is highly protectionist and highly committed to state intervention, this system expanded radically. That's our system of called military Keynesianism, of developing, protecting the parts of the economy that in fact function. It's a costly system. The Reaganite economic management, which was particularly disastrous, had the effects of, as you know, of turning the United States into a tremendous debtor country after having been the world's major creditor, of seriously affecting the trade balance and so on, and those are costs that we'll have to bear. But that's what comes from this kind of protectionism. I mean, particularly in the Reagan administration, we've succeeded in combining some of the worst features of state-run economies, inefficiencies and so on, with some of the worst features of private capitalism. It's a real achievement.
Okay. Ms. Perle, there's an economic power elite which provides the consistency in American foreign policy. Your response?
Well, of course, it is a lot more complicated than Professor Chomsky thinks it is. The making of American foreign policy is subject to a great many influences other than the room full of capitalist lawyers, bankers, and corporate executives that he conjures up, who in his view of the world have since 1945 been manipulating American policy in order to serve their own selfish financial interests. It's a simple enough model. It's a model that is intended to appeal. He keeps referring to the documents that prove it. He keeps coming back to the Policy Planning Council at the Department of State. I've served in government for a good many years now, and I've never yet seen a Policy Planning Council document that interested anyone except the authors at the Policy Planning Council. And anyone who thinks that American policy is based on the implementation of Policy Planning Council documents has never had the experience of either seeing one of those documents or grappling with the problem of implementing American foreign policy. There is no power elite of the kind that Professor Chomsky suggests there is manipulating the world in the interests of American capitalism. You're perfectly free to accept that model if you like, but no one who's had any association with the policy process would believe it for a minute.
Do you have an alternative notion of the policy process?
Well, as the question implied, there is a great deal that goes into the making of policy that includes things like imperfect knowledge and not necessarily understanding the social and political forces with which we're dealing. There are mistakes, to be sure. There's a lot of idealism in the process. People who believe that the United States ought to make sacrifices of various kinds in order to assist in the expansion of democracy around the world, and we've gotten ourselves into some trouble from time to time in an effort to accomplish that. But if you listen to Mr. Chomsky, you think that we are motivated entirely by a kind of rapacious elite looking after their own interests.
A question, we'll start with you, Mr. Perle, about terrorism. And what is terrorism? Does 170-plus dead Palestinians killed by settlers and Zionist troops qualify as terrorism? How about 700-plus dead South African youth in 1976 in South Africa? Is this terrorism? Does 40,000 dead Nicaraguans qualify as terrorism? If not, please explain.
Is that applause, I take it, is for the question and not for my answer. Let me say this. Whatever terrorism is, I would not define it in such a manner as to confuse acts by the PLO against non-combatants, frequently children, with action taken by George Washington in the American War of Independence. Now, it does seem to me that the essence of the concept of terrorism is an attack against non-combatants. That is, an attack against people who are not involved, not directly parties to a conflict. And one of the things that I object to in the analogy suggested by Professor Chomsky is the failure to recognize that when the PLO attacks a bus full of civilians, including children, and murders them, that is not in any way to be compared with a struggle for independence.
Okay.
May I comment on that one?
Well, I've given a definition of terrorism. You can apply it to those situations.
May I?
Sure.
I think that here again I'll unfortunately refer to U.S. documents, which I think are quite good. The U.S. Code has an official definition of terrorism. I think it's a pretty good one. State Department and Army documents, for example, the Army Manual Countering Terrorism, have good definitions of terrorism. I think we ought to keep to it. Basically, without quoting all the words, it comes down to just what you said. The threat or use of force to coerce and intimidate civilian populations. That's terrorism. Now, that would it would include, in fact, George Washington's actions. For example, they perhaps went beyond terrorism, like the destruction of the Iroquois civilization in 1779, the rampaging of Green's armies, and so on. I don't say that particularly critically. I really don't know of any national movement that didn't involve terrorism. But let's keep up until today. I agree with you that when the PLO attacks civilians, that's terrorism. Similarly, when the United States directs its proxy army, as it's called in internal documents again, when it directs its proxy army to attack soft targets, the words of General John Galvin testifying to Congress a year or two ago, to attack soft targets and not to, going on, to duke it out with the Sandinistas directly, that is to avoid defended targets and attack soft targets, that's terrorism. When Charles Redmond, of the State Department spokesman, endorses publicly the attack of our proxy forces against agricultural collectives on the grounds that there are some people with arms defending them, that's advocacy of terrorism, just as it would be if Gaddafi endorsed the attack of the attacks by the PLO against Israeli collectives, which are far better armed than the cooperatives that we're attacking. All that's terrorism. In fact, when former CIA Director Stansfield Turner testified before Congress in 1985 on this, he simply referred to our attack against Nicaragua as terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism. That's giving us the benefit of the doubt, I should say. If you take the World Court decision seriously, it may pass beyond terrorism to the much more serious crime of aggression, unlawful use of force. But giving the U.S. the benefit of the doubt, it's large-scale terrorism. When the PLO attacks a bus and kills civilians, that's terrorism. When Israel bombs civilian targets in the Bekaa Valley, killing with hundreds of maybe 400 casualties, including children killed in a bombed-out schoolhouse, mosques destroyed, markets destroyed, and so on, that's terrorism. In fact, there's plenty of terrorism in the world. By and large, the terrorism, it's a roughly fair generalization, that the more powerful the entity involved, the more terrorism it carries out. There are exceptions, but there's no doubt that we're doing quite well in that conflict. I might point out that we're one of the few countries in the world that's officially committed to terrorism. There are other terrorist states, but I want to stress that the United States has an official commitment to terrorism. The attack against the commitment to attack soft targets, such as agricultural cooperatives, that's an official commitment to terrorism. In fact, if you take a look at the U.S. Army published manuals on low-intensity conflict, the policy we're officially committed to, you will notice that the definition of low-intensity conflict happens to be almost word for word the definition of terrorism. The use of measures short of aggression to coerce and intimidate the population. That's low-intensity conflict. Take a look at the definitions. It's not that we're the only terrorist state, but we're ranked rather high in the competition for major terrorist power.
Mr. Perle?
I don't have anything to add to that.
A question, let's start with you, Professor Chomsky. The Nicaraguan government official who recently defected has stated that regardless of peace efforts, the Nicaraguan government will pursue a policy of military expansion with the Soviet Union. Why or why shouldn't, with the Soviet Union, why or why shouldn't we believe their claims that this is to be a defensive force?
Well, he's speaking of Colonel Miranda. who did not state, read the documents that he produced, he did not state or in any way imply that Nicaragua was in